Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hello. Wow, wow, wow. How was your first night? She's a beautiful ship, isn't she? Well, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who joined me last night at Motions, you would have got an introduction from our first guest speaker. One of the things we're really proud of on Silver Sea is our enrichment and destination lecture series. There's nothing better, in my opinion, than going into all of these incredible ports, but being empowered about what's going on as you go around the port, instead of actually just walking around looking, oh, that's nice, but actually knowing what the history is behind it. And of course, we are in one of the most majestic areas around the world. Alaska's just breathtaking and got so much history about itself. And so this next gentleman I'm going to introduce has got so much knowledge. I've got a bio for you. He's written it himself, so you can take it with a pinch of salt if you want to. Dr. J. Wolff earned his undergraduate and doctoral degrees at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. A member of the faculty of Florida Gulf Coast University's academic and elected a member of the British Royal Society of Health, he has published more than 100 articles on history and culture and healthcare in professional journals, as well as American Heritage, Forbes, American Legacy, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. When not at sea, Dr. J and his wife, Carol, are home in Naples, Florida. Any Floridians in here? Yeah, welcome to winter. Dr. J makes frequent guest speaker appearances throughout America. He has appeared as a commentator on the History Channel and other television broadcasts. His library of lectures includes more than 300 individual presentations covering Alaska, the Panama Canal, South America, the British Isles, Scandinavia, Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Orient, India, the Middle East, and the entire African continent. And it sounds like he could lecture on the entire world. His remarkable ability to deliver each full lecture without the use of notes or written references delight his audiences. And on a personal note, if you ever get the chance to speak to not just Dr. J, but his wife, Carol, they're absolutely the most loveliest people, and they will spend time speaking to you and enjoying a tea and coffee. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome to the stage the incredible Mr. Dr. J. Wolff.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see all of you here. We are starting our story of Alaska today. We will be presenting it in at least 3 different lectures, plus the talk about the Hubbard Glacier and any other moments that come along. And for some of you, you may be wondering, okay, we're going to be talking about Alaska. What's a Russian Imperial Double Eagle doing up there? And the answer is very simple. Alaska, as we know it, was created by the Russians. It starts long before Alaskan history starts. It starts about the year 800 AD, when a group of Vikings from Sweden land at the eastern end of the Baltic, move on to the Dnieper River, and head south, establishing trading posts along that river to trade for the magnificent furs from the great northern forests. They came for 2 things, actually. The first were the furs, and the second were the young people who lived in the forests, both boys and girls. They took them as slaves. They carried them down to the Dnieper, which flows into the Black Sea, and across to Anatolia, which became today's Turkey. And they were sold as slaves into the Arab or the Eastern Muslim world. A group of elders of these peoples who lived in the forests, and they acquired a new name because of what was being done to them, because they were being gathered as slaves. They came to be known as the Slavs. They still are. And a group of them came to the Russians. A group of these Slavic people came to these Swedish Vikings and said to them, "We are a great people, but we have no order. Will you come and rule over us?" And the Vikings did, and the peoples of the forest had a name for these Vikings. a name that probably comes from the original Finnish. And the word is Rus. They were the Rus, and when they became the rulers, they were the rulers of Russia. That's how Russia got started. How did Alaska get started? It starts with an incredible Russian. His name is Peter the Great, and he was called the Great because he was. He was born in 1682 in Moscow. By the time he was 17 years old, he was Tsar Peter I. We know he was somewhere between 6 feet 8 and 7 feet tall, very smart, and he had a serious goal in front of him. Russia at that time existed from the Carpathian Mountains east to the Ural Mountains. Siberia was another world. But Russia was what we would today call European Russia, except that it was not any longer a part of Europe. In the 14th century, or actually the late 13th century, the Mongols, sweeping east from their home in Mongolia by horseback, because this was great horse country, had conquered Russia, and they ruled it for almost 300 years. And during that period, Russia's face was turned east, because that's where their rulers were. So they missed the Renaissance in Europe. They missed the scientific revolution in Europe. They essentially became separated from Europe, so much so that when an English sea captain landed in Russia in the 16th century, he thought he had entered a new continent. He had never even heard of the place. Peter the Great was determined to bring Russia into the modern world. One of the ways he would do it is with trade. They were trading already on a limited way with China, but that trade was across Siberia, which is by land, slow, costly. Looking at a map and pondering it, Peter thought to himself, why can't we just sail out of the Baltic, north to the Arctic Ocean, and then just along the southern shore of the Arctic Ocean, right, hugging the coast of Siberia, and then down into the Pacific to China? It would be much shorter because it would be by ship. You could be carrying much more in the way of goods for each trip. It would be much more profitable. But he realized, I have to make certain that you can sail from the Arctic Ocean down into the Pacific. I don't know if there's a strait there or not. And so he started arranging for an expedition. It would have to cross by land all the way across Siberia and then sail out into those waters and determine if that was a passable route. Unfortunately, Peter the Great died in 1725. He was only 52. He died of tertiary syphilis, but his niece and then his second niece carried out his plans. He had picked a Danish captain to head his expedition. The man's name was Vitus Bering. Bering sailed east in 1741. They found that there was indeed a strait. They also found that on the other side of the strait was another world, which already had a name. It was called Alaska by the people who lived here. The word probably comes from the Aleut Indians, and it means the mainland, although we like to translate it as the Great Land. Certainly it sounds more interesting. But on their trip back, they ran into very bad weather. They essentially ran out of food. They tried to maintain themselves crossing the Pacific with whatever they could catch. There was a creature called the Pacific manatee, as big as the Florida manatee, which had a great deal of meat. It was very easy to catch, big, dumb, and slow. Unfortunately, the main disease they were fighting was scurvy, which is a lack of vitamin C, and the manatee meat didn't correct that. They also encountered another creature, and that is the sea otter, the largest of the weasels, 5 feet long, provided a modest amount of meat. It wasn't that great to eat, but the Russians quickly recognized that it had the most amazingly wonderful fur. Turns out the otter is a mammal, and it lives its full life in the sea, just like the whales and the seals and the walruses do. But unlike those great creatures, all of which have blubber, which is a 3 or so inch thick layer of fat under the skin to insulate them from the ice-cold waters of the North Pacific, the sea otter have no blubber. what they have is this incredible fur, which is so thick, so dense, and has an air pocket inside which prevents the water from touching their skin. It kept them warm. It turned out that if you bought a sea otter coat for your wife, it kept her warm, which kept you warm. In any case, when the Russians got home, they had taken some sea otter with them, and it set off a parade of fur hunters going back from Siberia to Russia. Starting in the year 1741, the first of these groups began landing on the far westernmost Aleutian Islands. They were a group of Russian fur hunters known as the Promyshleniki, sort of a clan-like group. They were sort of outside of Russian law. They had been collecting fur, primarily sable, in Siberia, which was not yet part of Russia, and they helped make Siberia part of Russia. Now they had the otter, which was even better. And so they began coming. They were taking otter. They were a very rough and ratty bunch, and they killed about as many otter and lost as they collected. They were making money, but they weren't making as much money as they should have been making. In the early 1790s, the Russian government decided to replace them with commercial fishing companies. And in 1793, this gentleman, Grigory Shelikov, an aristocrat, arrived in Russia with his wife. He was the head of the largest of the fur collecting operations. He landed on an island called Kikhtak. Today we call it Kodiak. And he established a harbor on the eastern end of the island, which he named Pavlovskaya Gavan, which in Russian means St. Paul's Harbor. The Russians loved naming things St. Paul or St. Peter or both. St. Peter and St. Paul are the great Russian 1-2 punch, if you will, of saints. Pavlovskaya Gavan was a harbor. Shelikov established his operations there. He had brought his wife, Natalia, who was the first European woman in Alaska. They began collecting fur efficiently. Profits went up. Everybody was satisfied. Shelikov was satisfied, except for one problem. It's 18,000 miles by sea from Pavlovskaya Gavan back to Russia. That's a very long supply road. So long that it really didn't work very well. They were endlessly running out of supplies, endlessly running into difficulties. He enjoyed living at a better level of life than that. And after only 3 years in Alaska, he decided to replace himself, which he did. He left, and he replaced himself with this man. These are sea otter, and they deserve to have one step higher in the sequence of events here so that you can see. They live their whole lives at sea, usually. They float on their backs, they eat, they often use tools. They'll often take a flat rock, put it on their belly, take a clam or an oyster they've got, and crack it open. They're one of the very few tool-using creatures of the sea. This gentleman is Alexander Baranov. He's the man who replaced Shelikov. He was not an aristocrat. He worked for the company. He was a Siberian commoner. He was a very smart man. He knew how to run business. He arrived in 1795, and he understood the problem. It was a very long supply route, but he immediately saw that an answer was at hand. American and British seamen or ships, sailors, were coming into Alaskan waters. They began hearing about the otter, and they were coming up with shiploads of one or another kind of goods to trade for sea otter fur. Baranov said, fine, you bring what I tell you to bring, and I'll trade you a lot of sea otter for that, and you will be my suppliers. It worked out very nicely on both sides. One of the traders who became a great friend of Baranov was a sea captain from Boston. His name was Honest Joe O'Kane. Now, I've always felt if a man's first name is Honest, you could probably trust him. Anyway, they would have drinking contests, which Baranov always won. Don't drink against the Russians. But they worked out the deal. They would bring the food, they would bring the various supplies, and they would get their otter fur in return. On one trip, Joe O'Kane said to Baranov, you know, down south, off the coast of California, the Americans are starting to take otter too, and they're coming north. They're going to be more of them than there are of you, and they're going to move right into your territory if you let them. What you have to do is establish a legal southern boundary. You have to set a boundary that they can't cross legally. Baranov agreed it was a good idea. The problem was he was running a commercial company. Commercial companies, whether they want to or not, can't set international boundaries. His ruler could, however, and he was being ruled by a very remarkable person. The ruler for Alexander Baranov was Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great has a great story of her own. This is what Catherine the Great looked like when she was 15 years old. She was the daughter of a German prince, the prince of a little German principality called Anhalt. There was no country of Germany in the 1700s, just a lot of little individual countries and two big countries, Bavaria and Prussia. Well, Anhalt was a very small country. She's a princess of a small country. She was 15. She was prettier than this. Also a very smart girl. Peter the Great had produced one son who had died, but he had several daughters, and one of his daughters had married a German duke, the Duke of Holstein, and that duke had a son. So that son, whose name was Peter, was the grandson of Peter the Great. Peter the Great died in 1725, and this is the next male heir. He is 1 year older than Sophie was. The plan was very simple. They would bring Sophie to Russia, make her into a Russian princess, bring Peter to Russia, make him into a Russian prince, marry them, and the Romanov dynasty is maintained. And so they offered Sophie the job, if you will, of becoming the Tsarina of Russia, which she thought was a lot better than being the Princess of Anhalt. And her parents agreed even more. This was a huge step up for them, financially as well as socially. And so they both came. He came from Holstein, which is in northern Germany, and she came from Anhalt, which is in southwestern Germany. They didn't know each other. When they arrived, the first thing they did with Sophie was that they changed her name. Sophie is not a German name. They gave her the Russian name of Ekaterina, or Catherine, which she thought was terrific. She learned Russian. She took to it like a fish to water. She loved the whole process of becoming Russian because she was going to become the ruler, or at least the wife of the ruler of Russia. Peter, on the other hand, well, I don't know the best way to put it is there was something wrong with him. Something wrong with him mentally. He wasn't crazy, he wasn't stupid, but he wasn't quite right. Early in their training, one day when they were learning the Russian language or whatever, and they were alone for a moment, he said to her, "This Russian business is the bunk. I was born a German. I will always be a German. I will never be Russian." It upset her for two reasons. First of all, he was going to be her husband, and he was going to be the Tsar of Russia. It's not good to have a Russian Tsar who's not Russian. Worse, it meant that he was rejecting her. She thought that this was a wonderful idea. They both got married. The marriage was 2 years later. He was 18, she was 17. An 18-year-old boy marries a 17-year-old girl who is very pretty, who is very smart, and is very eager. 7 or 8 months later, the ruler at that point was another descendant of Peter the Great, another woman. Her name was Helena, and she had been ruling now for several decades. Good ruler, smart woman. She knew that she could never marry. Any man she married would outrank her and take away from her stature. In any case, she called Catherine in to her private office. This is now 8 or 9 months after the marriage. And she points to her. "Why do I not see any sign of a new heir?" In other words, why aren't you pregnant yet? And Catherine replied, "I'm sorry, but I'm never going to be pregnant." "Why?" "He has never yet touched me." They've been married now for almost 9 months, and he's an 18-year-old boy married to a gorgeous 17-year-old girl who is very eager, and he hasn't yet touched her. As it turned out, they would be married for 17 years. He would never touch her. He had mistresses. We don't know what he did with them, but for whatever reason, he never touched Catherine. In any case, Helena said to Catherine, that doesn't matter. All that matters is providing an heir to the Romanov dynasty. You may acquire that heir by any means you wish. The first means was a captain of her guard by the name of Gregory Orloff. He fathered a son for her, which she named Paul. Her husband Peter didn't know any of this. It would go on for 17 years. Catherine prepared. In 1762, Helena died. Peter, her husband, became the Tsar. And as upsetting, as strange as he was as the crown prince, he was worse as the Tsar. He changed the uniforms of the Russian official royal guards into German-style uniforms with German-style parade maneuvers, all orders given in German. It became more and more apparent to the royal court that he was not suitable as a Tsar. He was definitely off base. Catherine had been preparing for this for years because she knew it was coming. He finally called her in one day and said, I'm sending you away because frankly, I'm not interested in you and I'm going to move my mistress in. 2 o'clock in the morning that night, she dressed in the uniform of an artillery captain, mounted a horse, rode to the nearest regiment of cavalry who knew her, rallied them. They rode to several other barracks and rallied others. When she arrived back at the palace about 4 o'clock in the morning, she had 14,000 men behind her. She awoke Peter. He came downstairs in his night shirt, and she said, you're out. I'm going to have you taken to a palace outside the capital. You'll live there. I will rule from here on. And he had nothing to say. She had all the spears behind her. He said, can I bring my mistress with me? She said, no. Mistress was sent back to Moscow, and we never hear of her again. Peter goes into exile. Catherine becomes the Tsarina and the ruler of Russia. 2 weeks later, the head of the guard of that palace comes to the royal palace with a message for his Tsarina. Yes, we have had an accident in the palace. We're terribly sorry. Peter is dead. It was just what had been planned. Catherine was ready for that. She stepped in 2 days of mourning, and Peter was forgotten. Paul, her son, was now in his teens. He thought that his mother had arranged to murder his father. But Peter wasn't his father. He didn't know that. Catherine did, in any case. Catherine ruled, and Peter stewed and hated her and despised her for it. Finally, in 1796, Catherine the Great died. She ruled for 36 years. Paul liked anything she hated. He hated anything she liked. She hadn't allowed Alaska to become a Russian crown colony. He did. Quickly as possible. This is Catherine the Great at the height of her powers. She had a whole series of prime ministers, and every one of them became her personal friend. After she was done with him, or he was done with her, she allowed those men to leave her and go on to other women. That was fine. She rewarded them with a title, with an estate, all the perquisites of being a powerful man. But she died at the age of 67. Paul immediately made Alaska a Russian crown colony. Baranov had the southern border, or he could establish the southern border that he needed. And he immediately proceeded to do that. These are the Chickasaw Islands, the Alexander Islands. We are going to be sailing between them and the mainland. That's what forms the Inside Passage. The largest of these islands is up here, Chickasaw. And on Chickasaw Island, right at the very northern edge of the island, Baranov established a fort, Fort St. Michael, an official Russian fort. This is now an official Russian colony. He put in 100 men as the garrison. They brought their wives with them. And they established that as their new southern border. Not all the time that Baranov had been trading with the Americans and the British for food and supplies, the Tlingit Indians, who were nobody's fool, were also trading with the Americans and the British for muskets and the training and the ammunition to learn how to use them. There's an interesting thing about the Russians, and we'll hear this several times along the way. As a people, for whatever reason, the Russians tend to be brave, they tend to be strong, they tend to be aggressive. They are terrible at doing little menial day-to-day affairs, regularly scheduled chores. They're terrible. They won't take out the garbage. In any case, the Tlingit noticed that the Russians were not good at keeping these ordinary, regular disciplines. There were days when there were a number of sentries on the walls of St. Michael's. There were days when there were no sentries. On one of the days when the Russians neglected to put any sentries up on the walls, the Tlingit attacked in force. Coming out of the forest by the hundreds, they swarmed over the fort before the Russians even knew they were coming. Within minutes, they held the whole fort. They killed all 100 of the Russian soldiers. They took their families. They burned Fort St. Michael down. Suddenly, Fort St. Michael doesn't exist anymore. Baranov's southern border is gone. Chickasaw Island has a very good natural harbor about halfway down, right about here. The Tlingit built a fort there, which they called the Stockade of Shishkinu, tall saplings. They ruled the island from their fort. And for the next 2 years, Baranov had no southern border. But in 1802, Russia had sent out the first ship of the growing new Russian Navy that would sail around the world. She was the ship Kiev, a fully armed frigate which had been built in Britain and launched into the Thames in 1801 as the HMS Thames, and then turned over to the Russians as part of a growing alliance between the two. She sailed into Pavlovskaya Gavan, and Baranov immediately appropriated her, used her as a central point to come south and take back his southern border. This is the Kiev. The other two smaller ships the Russians had built in Alaska, and the small boats are their Aleut hunters, who are now soldiers in the attack. And they attacked Shishkinu. The battle lasted 4 days. It's known as the Battle of Alaska. The Indians held their ground. They were very good with the muskets. They were tough enemies. The one thing they couldn't deal with were the cannon. The Neva had a full complement of cannon. After 4 days of bombardment, the Tlingits had had enough. They melted away into the forest. Baranov, or his men, took the site. They burned Shishkinu to the ground. And Baranov thought, now this is a much better place for a southern border. It's got a good harbor, and I'm going to hold it with force. And therefore, he established that as his new southern border. He built a fort. He built a large mansion for himself, and a town grew up around it and around the harbor, and he named it New Archangel. New Archangel was his new southern border. He had 18 of these made, they're solid copper, and mounted all along the southern border, and they established, do not cross, this is Russian Crown territory. And it worked. They were taking otter. The otter fur were extremely desirable. It is, by any measure, the finest fur in the world. Don't go looking for it in your local furrier shop, however. I was lucky enough to actually feel a otter fur, and you can compare it to sable, you can compare it to ermine. It's finer than that. China particularly loved these furs. Chinese imperial officers had fur-lined robes that they wore, and lining it with sea otter made it the richest and most sumptuous of all uniforms. China was closed to the outside world. It would stay closed to the outside world for another few decades until the European powers pried it open with their guns. But during this period, China had explored the world in 1400, decided that there was no place as good as China, and therefore they didn't need the rest of the world. And they sealed themselves off. But they wanted whatever was good out there, so they had a regular market in the city of Canton, which was the name in Chinese is Guangzhou, and had a good harbor. And the Russians began sailing into the harbor of Guangzhou with their ships loaded with sea otter fur, which the Chinese just adored, snapped it up, and business was going extremely well. But Alaska was still a problem. And again, it has to do with the Russian inability to do routine, regular, scheduled things. Alaska never grew enough food to feed the people, to feed their colony. Baranov recognized this, but Baranov ran into another problem first. He was regularly sending money back to Russia, and I mean a lot of money, about 3 million rubles a year, as their share of the money he was getting for the fur. This is a great deal. At least it should have been. But there was a problem. Baranov, as I said, was not an aristocrat. He was a commoner. He called himself the Lord of Alaska. He lived like he was the Lord of Alaska. At the Russian palace, the Russian throne, if you will, in St. Petersburg, true aristocrats surrounded the Tsar. This would be Alexander I. And they began whispering in his ear about this Baranov back in Alaska. He's not sending all the money to you that he owes you. He's stealing some of it. He calls himself an aristocrat and he's not. Don't trust this man. Enough of that in the Tsar's ear, and he acted. Alexander I had a temper. And so a new soldier arrived in Alaska, a captain of artillery, presumably, by the name of Leonti Hagemeister, but he wasn't a captain of artillery, he was something else. He was a spy. And he was the worst kind of a spy because he was an accountant. And his job was simple. Go through Baranov's books and establish just how he's stealing from the Tsar. It took Hagemeister a year. He went through the books. He probably forged the results, but he found what he wanted. And when he made the announcement, Baranov, I have the proof in my hand, has been stealing from the Tsar. Baranov is under arrest, and he will be taken back to St. Petersburg and put on trial for treason, which he was. Baranov was taken on board a Russian warship. He was, at this point, 73 years old. He thought he was doing a great job. Suddenly, he's told, not only are you not doing a great job, you're a crook. The ship sailed across the Pacific. Their first stop was the capital of Dutch East Indies on the island of Java, the city of Batavia. By the time they got to Batavia, Java, Baranov was very sick. He was taken off the ship, and within just a few days, he died. He probably died of a broken heart, but in any case, he had done a great job. He had created the Russian fur industry. He had done a terrific job of harvesting the otter, and for that he was rewarded by being killed. Alaska, again, because of Russia's inability to do the little things, never grew enough food to feed the Russian population there. The land on the west coast of North America, this is the early 19th century, was curiously divided. If you started from the south, Mexico until 1821 was a province of Spain. In 1821 it broke away and became an independent country. But north of Mexico, across the Rio Grande River, you passed into an area known as New Spain. To the east it was Texas, and to the west it was California. And coming up the west coast, it was all controlled by the Mexicans until you got past San Francisco Bay. Once you got north of San Francisco Bay, the Mexicans no longer had the ability or the desire to have any control. Nobody else had any control either. The United States hadn't gotten there yet. Britain knew about it. Britain hadn't gotten there yet. Russia's southern border was 5440 degrees south. So what you had was about 1,000 miles from the Russian southern border to the northern border of New Spain. And in that open, much of that was what is today Northern California, Baranoff established a fort, Fort Roycia, to grow food. The ground is fertile, there's rain, and the Europeans just haven't gotten there yet. So Fort Roycia is established as an outpost to grow food to feed Russian Alaska. They never grew enough food to pay for the cost of running the fort. They paid for it by harvesting otter off the coast of California themselves. But the Russians were very rapacious in taking fur. If there were 10 fur-carrying animals, and they could, they'd kill all 10. Every one of them paid money. Well, what about the next generation? Never mind. We'll find others. They kept doing this, and by the 1840s, now Baranoff is dead, he's been replaced by a man named Baron Wrangel. The population of sea otter, which had probably been about 300,000 when the Russians first got there, is now down to under 2,000. So few that essentially there's not enough left to support a fur industry any longer. They couldn't pay for Fort Roycia, and so Baron Wrangel, who's now ruling Russian Alaska, puts Fort Roycia up for sale. Now, he knew who he wanted to sell it to. Living in the land north of the Mexican rule in California was a farmer, more than a farmer. He owned 43,000 acres of land there because the Mexican government had given it to him to keep him friendly. He was a miller who grew his own grain, milled his own flour, baked his own bread, grew vegetables as well. He was a good friend of Baron Wrangel. He sold a lot of food to the Russians. Sometimes he came north to Alaska to have dinner. And he had a very unusual view of what was going on in the western part of North America at that time. This is now the 1840s. He saw, first of all, he said, the United States and Mexico are getting ready to have a war. No question about it. There's trouble over Texas, squabbling over Americans coming into California. They're going to fight. At the same time, Britain and the United States are going to have a war because Britain, which holds Canada, wants to have a port on the Pacific. The United States wants to have a port on the Pacific, and they can't quite agree on how to work that out. And in addition to those two wars, it looks like the United States is going to wind up having a war with itself. However it works out, he had in his mind a very clear thought. I want to be certain that when all the shooting is done, California winds up as part of the United States, not part of Mexico, not part of Britain, and he had a fort built next to his mill up on the American River in California to help support that. Now he bought Fort Roycia. Roycia, by the way, means Russia. Fort Roycia, the name was changed to Fort Ross. Now he had two forts. The miller's name, by the way, this is the miller. The miller was born on the Swiss-German border in Europe, came to the New World as a young man, and established himself, so he was a Swiss, and his name was John Sutter. And sure enough, in 1848 at Sutter's Mill, the whole issue was settled very simply. the U.S. had beaten Mexico in the Mexican War, and then we found gold in California. So John Sutter was a big part of this settlement of this part of the world. Of course, it didn't do much for Russia, and that's the point. The Russians found that the Otter were no longer making them any money. Fort Roycia was gone. The Otter were gone. Alaska was just, well, what was Alaska? A great big piece of ice. In 1856, the Russians wrote what they called a white paper. It's a diplomatic document which specifies their viewpoint, and they spelled it out. 4 points. First point, Alaska is very far from Russia. Second point, the Americans are giving us only otter as a possible value. The otter are gone. The only thing left here is timber. Alaskan timber is good, but we just took Finland as a colony. It has timber just as good, and it's right next door to Alaska, to Russia. So Alaska is of no use to us. The third issue is that the Americans have just fought a war with Mexico. They're going to fight a war sooner or later with Britain over Oregon. They're going to fight a war with themselves. And if we're still here, we're going to get drawn in even if we don't want to be. And the fourth issue, ever since it was started back on the East Coast, America has been endlessly expansionistic. Sooner or later, it's going to have everything from Panama to the North Pole, including Alaska. Better we sell it to them rather than they just take it from us. They couldn't just present it to the United States because the Civil War intervened, but in 1867, the ambassador in the United States, Baron de Stockel, was given the job of offering Alaska to the Americans. And they said to him, their bosses in St. Petersburg, we know Alaska is worthless. We're going to put a price on it of $5 million, but that's just a joke. We know that it's going to be sold for a lot less. Try to get as much as $1 million for it. That's your goal. The man he was dealing with is this man, William Seward, who was the United States Secretary of State. And when de Stockel began dealing with Seward, he recognized that de Stockel was doing something, that Seward was doing something very peculiar. He was negotiating against himself. So you say you want $5 million. Oh, okay, I'll give you $5.5 million. No? Okay, I'll give you $6 million. No, I'll give you $6.5 million. De Stockel just sat there. Finally, he realized, I got to sell this to him before he comes to his senses. And so he did for $7.2 million in gold. Seward was very happy. He had removed another dictator from the North American continent, he felt. But the Americans didn't think so. This was Seward's folly. This was Seward's icebox. James Stewart, who ran a newspaper, the New York Herald, ran a banner over his headline every morning. Attention, any potentate wanting to sell useless land, contact Seward, State Department, Washington, D.C. It was turned over in October at Baranoff's Fort. Maria Maksutova was the wife of the Russian envoy who was there. She fainted. This is what the New Archangel looked like at the time of turnover. New Archangel is not an American name, and so they changed the name. This is Baranoff's house. Baranoff has long since been dead, but the house still stands. This is the Russian Orthodox Cathedral, which if we visit Sitka and you visit it, it's beautiful because it still stands. It was built in the early 1820s, and it's perfectly the same as it was the day it was built. Not a thing has been changed except the fact that it burned to the ground in 1967. But it's been perfectly rebuilt, including a Russian Orthodox priest who holds services there. This is the house that Baranoff used to live in, and this is how it ended up in the 1890s. It burned to the ground. The only thing that was operating in Alaska was an American Army post. Jefferson Davis was the commander. No, not that Jefferson Davis. This Jefferson Davis had been a Union Army commander during the Civil War. As a matter of fact, in 1862, in the Galt House in Louisville, Kentucky, he confronted his commanding officer, Major Bull Nelson. Sir, you've got to do something about this. my men, my staff officers, they make fun of my name behind my back. Nelson was a big man, bigger than John Wayne. Why don't you do something about it? But sir, Nelson slapped Davis across the face. Shouldn't have done that. Davison drew his pistol and killed him. Now, the U.S. Army Code of Conduct frowns on murdering your superior officer. Davis stood trial. He was found innocent because he pled his temper. Nelson knew I had a temper, and he goaded me. In any case, Nelson was dead. Davis was found innocent, but the U.S. Army left. And by 1875, Alaska had 900 Americans in it. No otter, no timber, no nothing. Nobody was coming, although it looked like there might be something in those mountains. Nobody could be sure what it was, but it might be something. However, what that something might be, we're going to talk about next time. Because that something turned out to be very, very important. This afternoon, we're going to be at Hubbard Glacier. I'll be up on the bridge, and I'll be talking about glaciers. Hubbard is a very interesting glacier to see. If you've never seen one before, or you don't fully understand how glaciers work, I think it'll be an interesting talk for you. The next time we meet here will be the second chapter of the story of Alaska. The name is very self-explanatory. We are going to talk about the gold rush. I hope to see you all here for that talk. Thank you all so much for coming today.